Yes, thank you. Borstein,
You're on mute.
Director Borstein.
I am here.
Thank you. Gaffney,
Present.
Kelly.
Here.
Meggs,
Here.
Scylla.
Here.
Thank you. All
Thank you.
present.
And join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
You're muted yourself.
You're mute, Marin.
You missed me read off that whole thing. Okay. Item number 2, informational presentation number 3, the Surplus Land Act. Steve, can I hand it over to you now?
Thank you, President Scylla, and thanks to the board for making time available for this special board meeting and for our guests that have joined us. We have folks from the Century Urban team, as well as Council Riley Hurd, who works for the district. And I would like to introduce this item. Again, just to remind the board, this is the third informational presentation about the disposition of surplus property at 2000 Larkspur Landing Circle, the site of the former wastewater treatment plant that operated there up until 1984. And the first informational presentation, you may recall, was about the type of transaction structure the board may elect to use in terms of disposing of the property. We talked about options to purchase or selling the property, or a ground lease option, or entering into some type of joint venture business proposal. And then the second informational presentation was about the entitlements, the land use entitlements the property currently has based on work that was done in the 2000s and some specific linkage to the general plan, and the fact that the city of Larkspur is updating their general plan currently. It's an active process, and we'll talk about that a little later today. So that was the focus of the second informational presentation. Today is the third informational presentation focused on statutes at the state level that have been enacted most recently in the last year or two, but also dating back to the 80s in a package of lawmaking known as the Surplus Lands Act. And those aspects of that existing law that affect whatever transaction structure or land use entitlements that are attached to this surplus property that the district owns. So today we'll discuss what the requirements are of the Surplus Lands Act. But before we get started, and before I hand this off, I'd like to remind the board and the interested public about the Sanitary District's enabling statute under the Health and Safety Code, the Sanitary District Act of 1923. And what does it say about the treatment of surplus property by sanitary districts, specifically in state law? So with that, I'd like Julia to allow me to be the presenter. And see if I can make this thing work. I'm just going to pull up one simple thing before I hand it off. And have you handed that off to me yet?
Yes, GM Moore, you are the presenter.
Okay. Well, you'd think it'd have been nice and smooth. But my Word document is not turning up. Oh, there it is. Okay, I got it. Okay, the Sanitary District Act of 1923. Under this law, section 1614.1A of the Sanitary District Act states a district may lease for a term not exceeding 99 years, subject to periodic review, district property that will not be needed for district purposes during the term of the lease as a means of providing revenues to the district for the operation and maintenance of sanitary sewer system and wastewater treatment and disposal facilities of the district, and to finance the acquisition, construction, and improvement of these facilities, amended in 1994. So the reason why I bring this up is just to make the simple statement that disposition of surplus property in sanitary districts, hundreds of them across the state of California, is contemplated in our enabling statute. And it recognizes that land is an asset recognized in state law for the districts to use as a means to diversify its revenue sources with the goal of keeping sewer service charges or sewer rates at a minimized level for the benefit of its ratepayers. And the purpose of these revenues these revenues can be purposed to finance the wastewater enterprise. And this is it's contemplated in state law, and so it's a reasonable and appropriate action for the district to consider leasing or selling its surplus property. So I thought that was a useful exercise to just bring this back to our enabling statute, that this is part of typical district business. And with that, I wanted to introduce our district counsel, Andrea Clark, who's done some research into the Surplus Lands Act and has prepared a presentation and an overview of how the Surplus Lands Act affects the decisions about disposition of the property at Larkspur Landing. Thanks.
Okay, so as soon as Julia switches this over to me, then I will go ahead and share my screen.
Andrea, you should be able to share now.
Okay. Can everybody see this presentation first page?
That's a yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'm now in presentation mode, so this is all you should be seeing, and I think I can see what you see. So unless I see hands waving wildly, I will go ahead and move forward. So thank you, Steve, for that introduction. So as Steve mentioned, this is the third in our series of informational presentations related to the district-owned property at 2000 Larkspur Landing Circle. And today's presentation is about the Surplus Land Act, which very generally, as I think everybody probably knows, is a law that dictates a process that public agencies have to generally follow when they dispose of land that they don't need. I want to say at the outset that the Surplus Land Act, while it's been in existence for a while, it was actually first put in existence in 1968, has changed significantly in just the last year. And that some details of the process, including even the scope of some new exemptions to the process, have yet to be finalized. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So my goal here is to give the board a general overview of what the Act requires. And in future meetings and as we move through the process, we'll drill down on whether and how the Act applies to the district's decisions about the Larkspur Landing property. Okay, so just my brief agenda. It's not a very long presentation, but I'll start out with a little bit of history and intent. Then I'll summarize the requirements of the SLA, which is the Surplus Land Act. And then I'll talk briefly about enforcement of the Act, which is one of the areas that has changed pretty significantly in the past year. Okay, so history and intent. The Surplus Land Act was first passed in 1968. Its intent from the start has been to advance affordable housing, parks and open space, and schools by mandating certain processes when agencies dispose of lands. And these procedures prioritize these uses by making the land that the agency no longer needs available first to certain entities that will use it for these purposes. And again, it applies to public land that is surplus, which means it's not necessary for the agency's use. The AB 1486 makes it onto this slide because it's a bill from 2019 that significantly changed the law and has and is still basically in the infancy of its implementation. Some of the changes took effect in January 2020, and some have just taken effect on January 1 of this year. So, for example, the bill expanded the definition of public agencies that are subject to the Act. Actually, prior to January 2020, it was somewhat ambiguous under the statute whether the Act actually applied to sanitary districts. It now clearly does after this bill. The bill also added certain procedural requirements and incorporated a substantive role for the California Department of Housing and Community Development, including monitoring compliance with the Act by public agencies, reviewing and evaluating documents along the way, and as of the start of this month, carrying out enforcement of the Act, which I'll talk about a little later. That department, which I've labeled on here HCD, in November released some draft guidance for public agencies in carrying out the Act. This is not uncommon for a state agency to put out guidance or some level of regulations that tell the community exactly what is intended by the legislative language. Their goal was to take comments and release the final guidance on January 1 of this year. But the guidance has yet to be finalized. It's supposed to now be finalized at the end of this month. That's what we're being told. But I'm mentioning this specifically because there are a number of details on the process that are of interest to this district and many other districts that haven't yet been finalized. There were a number of comments that have gone in, that went in by a number of associations and entities that are of interest to this district, and we don't yet know whether and how the HCD will modify its guidance based on those comments. So I'm saying it because I think it's important to know that this is a shifting landscape, and Ross Valley Sanitary District may be navigating this new and shifting landscape pretty early in its implementation, which I think is something that we need to keep in mind. Okay, so to jump into a relatively high-level summary of the SLA process, the first thing that happens is that the agency formally declares land surplus, meaning, as I said before, that it's no longer necessary for the agency's use. The Act then prohibits any negotiations for sale or lease of that property until the agency has sent what's called a notice of availability of the property to a specified list of entities, including local public agencies, housing sponsors that have notified HCD of their interests, parks and recreation departments for open space purposes, and school districts for potential school facilities or open space purposes. If the agency receives one or more than one notice of interest within 60 days of sending out that notice of availability, the agency must negotiate in good faith for 90 days with each interested party. The statute and the guidelines spell out certain priorities that have to be given as between those interested offers. So for example, if the agency receives more than one notice of interest, not only does the agency have to negotiate in good faith with each of them, but if there are multiple offers, the statute requires that certain priorities be given. And I've listed a couple of them very generally here. Priority has to be given to entities that are compliant with certain parts of the government code that, for example, require at least 25% of units are affordable housing. And then if they both, for example, if you have two entities and they both meet that, then priority has to be given to the greatest number of units. So despite those kind of rules about how you can negotiate the statute also says that if price and terms can't be reached, if none of the 90-day negotiation periods results in a deal, then the agency can go ahead, or I should back up, or if no notices of interest are received, then the land can go ahead and be sold or leased outside of the process. But there are continuing affordability restrictions that apply even if you've made it through the required process and you haven't reached a deal. And importantly, the Act doesn't require that the land be disposed at less than fair market value. So the idea here isn't to force agencies to sell market at less than, to sell the property at less than fair market value. The idea is that hopefully you can get some offers at or above fair market value that are also meet these affordability requirements. So these basic requirements are relatively simple, but there are all sorts of details in each one of these that have to be carefully followed, which is one reason that the final set of guidance from the HCD is going to be really important. And we had hoped that we would have gotten it by now. I'm providing a whole slide on enforcement for a reason. I want to underscore the potentially significant consequences of violations of the Act. So first of all, one of the effects of AB 1486 is that this Department of Housing and Community Development is really involved in the process. They're basically overseeing the whole thing. All of the documents you send out, the agency needs to send to HCD. Summaries of negotiations have to be sent. So there's this entity that's essentially watching the process as it's going on. And then if the department, if that entity finds that there's a violation, they'll let you know. And if you haven't cured it within 60 days, then the penalty is 30% of the sale price if you've come to a deal and sold it. And then subsequent violations are 50% of the sale price. In addition to that, the Act provides a private right to bring an action to enforce the provisions of the Act. And specifically, the statute lists 3 different types of folks who can enforce it. Anybody who's been notified with the notice of availability, anybody who would have been eligible to apply for residency in any affordable housing developed, or any beneficially interested person or entity, which of course is not really defined. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of folks who can essentially bring an action to enforce the specific requirements of the Act. So the bottom line is these are relatively new requirements. They have a fair amount of detail. Those details are still being finalized, and the consequences of violations are really significant. So as staff, we're keeping track of the requirements. We've been educating ourselves. We're aware of how the issues played out in the drafting of the legislation, and we're making sure that we're up to speed so that as this process moves forward, we can appropriately advise the board on how the requirements apply to however the board decides to dispose of the property, if the board decides to dispose of the property. So that is my brief overview of the Surplus Land Act. More to come, but I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any at this time.
Yes, Doug, I saw your hand first.
Thank you. Is the Sanitary Act of 1923 as amended in 1994 in conflict with the Surplus Land Act? When I saw the beginning of your first slide, it said you can't sell or lease. Is a land lease the same as the lease contemplated in the beginning of this of the Surplus Land Act?
Yes, I think a lease is the same as contemplated in the Health and Safety Code. I believe, although I didn't have it in front of me, that the Health and Safety Code also gives the district the basic right to dispose of, not just lease, but to sell property. It's an interesting question. Are they in conflict? As a general matter, they're not. There may be some areas where there may be some conflicts, but we're working through what that means and what the consequences are of choosing one process over another. But I think it's fair to say that the intent of the Surplus Land Act is to generally occupy this field, because if it was, most districts, most public agencies in California have the right to purchase and sell property and dispose of it. And if by virtue of them having that right, they could argue that they don't have to comply with the Surplus Land Act, then that would be a loophole that would essentially swallow the set of rules, if that makes sense. So at this point, I'm not too concerned about basic conflicts between the two processes.
Pam, I saw your hand raised also.
Thank you, Andrea, for that. One question I have is this notice of interest. Where does that come in on the program of this process, which is a bit convoluted, but where does that come into the process or the program of the process? Because this is sort of like somebody from the public who has interest in buying or leasing or whatever, they approach us, correct? And is there a time frame? Do we notify the public? So that's my first question.
Well, when you say when we notify the public, what's required under the Surplus Land Act is once you have declared that you have surplus property, you then cannot sell it until you have provided this notice to specific parties and given these specific parties an opportunity to express interest. If they do, you then have to have a 90-day good faith negotiation period with one or more of them. If you get through that process and you don't have a deal, that's when you can put out a general RFP out to the market and anybody from the public can participate. This is intended to be a prioritization to give, a first opportunity to certain parties who would use it in these certain ways to negotiate to purchase the property or to lease the property. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was good, Andrea. I kind of had to, I think I got it. But my next question on that is when you say, when we notice the public on what we're going to, are you saying how we define the surplus land? Do we have power over on how we're going to define it for lease or sale? That sounds a little weird.
Typically, typically what public agencies have done in these notices is to declare it a surplus and put a notice of availability out to all those parties and say we're offering it for lease or sale. I don't yet know how this district will define what its interest is with respect to lease or sale. If it wants to keep all of its options open, it might just say lease or sale. If it wants to narrow its options, it could say one or the other. So it's really up to the agency as to how broad that sort of offer is in that first notice.
Okay, so to move the land along, we have to declare something, basically, right?
Well, we have to declare it. The first step in this process is to declare that the land is surplus. In other words, that we don't need it.
Do we?
And then, go ahead.
So are you saying we don't have to declare it?
If we intend to use the land or we need it for district purposes, then we don't have to declare it surplus. But I don't see how an agency could put land out on the market, which in itself messages that we don't need it, without first declaring that it's surplus and going through the process.
That's what I was getting at. I should have probably said that more clear in the beginning. So, so we're really not at that point to really let the community know what we're doing because we haven't even got to that declaration yet, right? So I'm just a little concerned that we keep having special meetings, and I've asked a couple of times to put more PR out about these meetings, and I'm getting some feedback like nobody knows when we're having these meetings all on the Larkspur property. And so anyway, that's another request that I'll talk about at some point before the meeting's over. Thank you, Andrea. That was good.
Any other board members have any questions or comments at this point? Yes, Michael. Michael, you're still on mute.
No, not anymore. I found the little green button. I've been on Zoom with CASA all day, so it's different. I just want to make sure that we are alerting our constituents to this and everybody else through our general manager's bulletin, and it is on our website. Isn't that true?
Yeah, we've been noticing all these informational meetings along the way.
Okay, so I think that there's plenty of notice, and anyway, so I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Pam, did you have something to say?
Yeah, they're on there, but they're under a meeting, and you go to our website, you can't see anything on the front page. I mean, I'd have to say that other communities working on general plans and have these issues are very visible on how they put things on the front of their page of their website. And, you know, we're not doing that. And there's also other special districts, jurisdictions, they have a sign up where you can get these meetings when they're happening. You sign up and we send them a notice when the meeting's going to happen. Where else is it? So I'm just saying this is how I kind of see it. Maybe I'm the more critical one on transparency, but I really want this to be really open to the community, and whatever you guys want to think, that's where I'm at.
Pam, I want to agree with you, but I want to also point out we're really in the procedural stage here. We're not in the stage of doing anything. We're learning about how we're about to propose things. We haven't declared the property surplus. When we do, that certainly will be, I'm sure, in the Marin IJ, and people will notice it. Right now, we're just, I mean, not that I disagree with making all meetings as transparent and public as possible, but the real juice is about to come.
Okay, and now I guess, are there any members of the public on the telephone who would like to, or on the screen, who'd like to comment or have any questions for Andrea about this? All right, hearing none, then
I have a question. I don't know if you can see whether I've unmuted or not.
I can. Go ahead. Please tell us your name and what town you're from.
Yeah, Bob Silvestri from Mill Valley. I have two questions. The partnership that we have put together that has interest in the land includes Eden Housing, which is a very well-known affordable housing developer in Marin and around the Bay Area, one of the bigger ones. My assumption is that a large, and I can find this out for myself, of course, but I was just curious if you know, it seems like a large, active, nonprofit housing developer, affordable housing developer like that would be on this list, right? The housing, getting this notice, the notice of availability. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I don't know if it's on the list. The parties on the list have put themselves on the list. So
yeah, well, I'll make sure they are, but I just was curious. The second thing is, what I think is interesting about the statute is, and I believe in my reading this is true, but I'd be interested if you researched it and had an opinion. If for some reason RVSD wanted to control what was built on the property, meaning that, if you put something out for sale or lease, you lose control of what can be done within reason, because if you know what the fair market value is going in, which you're going to have to know in this scenario because of the law. In other words, you'll need an appraisal. Otherwise, there's no way for you to negotiate with these housing people up front if you don't know what it's worth. So you can't know if they're offering you fair market value. So given that you have an appraisal, once you do that, then what they can build is now predominantly controlled by state law and the city of Larkspur. I mean, that's what's going to determine what's allowable. However, what I'm curious about as I read it, if RVSD wanted to control that, it seems to me that they would be in their right to decide on a development team. I'm just suggesting the possibility that they wanted to build what they wanted to see there in a joint venture that was technically a joint venture, but it was predominantly done, and the liability and responsibility to the joint venture partner developer. By doing that, they don't have to declare it surplus land, because they're saying under the 1923 Act that we're creating this joint venture in order to derive revenue from it. We're a partner in this joint venture. I've structured many joint ventures with public-private partnerships, and like that, and many other people have too. That says, no, we still own it. We have an interest, potentially, an interest that satisfies the act, and says we're not declaring it surplus land. We're going to develop it, but we're not going to be the developer. We have a partner, and we have a financial arrangement with that partner, and we're going to benefit from that. Is that is that something you've thought of?
Well, it's a little bit outside of the scope of my presentation today. I guess one comment I would say about that is it would depend on the nature of the public agency and its mission, and whether, I mean, I would hesitate to say that you could avoid Surplus Lands Act application by saying you're not actually disposing of the property through that. I suppose a public agency could develop property, but again, I would want to look at whether that's within the mission and the authority of the agency in the first place. But I mean, my fundamental answer is that it's a little outside of the scope of what my presentation is today.
I understand that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I just
Right.
thought that occurred to me. Thank you.
Any other public have comments or questions? All right, hearing none, we'll move on to agenda item number.
One thing, sorry, President Priscilla.
Yeah.
I think one thing that the discussion reminded me of is, as we've talked about the SLA requirements, I don't know that, Andrea, you touched on it so much in your presentation, but it might be worth answering the question, are there exemptions from the Surplus Lands Act that are specified in the statute? And what are some examples of them?
Sure. There are a number of exemptions. There's an exemption associated with a certain size of property, if it's a very small piece of property. If a local agency is exchanging the property for another one that's necessary for its use, if it's transferring the land to another local agency, if there's an exception related to putting the property out to a competitive bid process for a pretty narrow, specific type of use, development of the process. And then there's a little bit, a slightly more complex set of, not so much exemptions, but certain agencies can hang on to property and use them for generation of revenue under certain circumstances when it directly furthers the purpose of the express purpose of the agency, or it's expressly authorized by some other statute. Some of these exemptions were the subject of quite a bit of back and forth and debate and controversy during the legislative process, and they are in fact the subject of some of the items and topics in the HCD guidance document that we're waiting to see what they say, and that agencies across the state are waiting to see what they say, because frankly the sweeping nature of changes to the statute over the last year or two has added a fair amount of uncertainty to the process. And when you have, my enforcement page is still up here, when you have violations that are this severe, it's important to get it right. And so, I guess I go back to my earlier comment about how this is still a bit of a shifting landscape, and we're going to have to keep watching it as it moves forward.
And I think it does speak to, or I would characterize, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would characterize the exemptions to the SLA as fairly narrow, and that the legislative intent of these, especially these most recent changes to the Surplus Lands Act under AB 1486, it seems to, try to narrow the exemptions in the effort to really, for lack of a better term, force the local special districts to navigate this process, as opposed to try to find a way around it.
I agree with that. The exemptions are very narrow.
Yeah, and so therefore, this is a good educational process for ourselves, the board, the interested public, that there's a process here that's being laid out, and what are the parameters of that process and the expectations. And one of the key points, which we heard from one commenter, was establishment of fair market value. So when before we go to the next board item, I thought I did want to at least talk about what would be the next steps, because this is the third informational presentation. So we've now gathered some facts about these requirements that we likely need to navigate because the exemptions are narrow. What are the next steps? So I think it's worth noting that our plan for the team that's here assembled, we've discussed another informational presentation to the board about an appraisal of the property, to begin to determine what fair market value is, to inform the process going forward. So I just wanted to point that out, just to let folks know that we're continuing along this track of gathering information, because we have not received final sign-off from US EPA at this time on the cleanup of the property. The report is in their hands. They're going to respond when they respond. But until we have final sign-off, we really aren't in a position as an agency to declare, to take the step of declaring the property as surplus, or to initiate this type of process. But we can continue to do work. And part of that will be gathering the information together to establish a fair market value to inform this process that we likely need to go through. So I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, and sorry for jumping the gun to move on from this agenda item. It's a big one.
And I welcome any other input. I don't want to take up all the air in the room, and folks that are gathered here, taking time out of their busy days to join our meeting. If you have any thoughts or questions, we do want to engage on this subject of the Surplus Lands Act, and any experience people have or thoughts.
Pam, I saw your hand.
Yeah, when are we doing an appraisal? And how is that process going to happen? Are we doing this before the EPA signs off or after?
Yeah, so we'll do it in parallel. Before we get final sign off, we can initiate this. You might recall that as part of the Century Urban team, there's a company on that team called CBRE, and they are initiating the process right now about generating an appraisal. And they actually, as it turns out, CBRE conducted an appraisal of this property, 2000 Larkspur Landing Circle, and I believe it was in the year 2012. Felicia's nodding her head. And so they have experience with the property and can build on the work they've already done. So yeah, the plan is we're moving forward with that Century Urban team. It's not just simply CBRE, but also, you know, looking at the Larkspur general plan process, the existing entitlements, and bringing a well thought out analysis so the board can see that. And that will be in the next couple of months. Right now we have a placeholder date of the week after the March board meeting.
And that'll be available to the public?
Andrea?
No, we'll have a closed session discussion about that.
Why is that?
Because we don't, because the Brown Act doesn't force public agencies to show all their cards when they're about to negotiate.
I saw Riley shake his head also. Riley, would you mind telling us why? So is it that the appraisal is not public? Is that correct? Was I?
Oh, yeah, I wasn't meaning to step in there, but I was just shaking my head because if you let the appraisal go out as public, you will lose all negotiating power. And I assure you, the price will end up at the appraisal price or around it. So the Brown Act allows you to meet in closed session for real estate negotiations because it's one of the things that you cannot telegraph. Otherwise, the negotiation becomes moot if the last, best, and final number is disclosed in advance.
Okay, so you're treating it like a same as a private deal. Okay, I
Yeah,
get it.
same thing we did when we bought the Comcast building.
Agreed.
Thank you, Riley.
I could tell you had input, Riley.
Same as Andrea's.
Yeah, this is Brian. I'll also share, this is consistent with our other public agency work throughout the Bay Area when you're about to potentially enter into negotiations. So this is, you know, from our perspective, standard procedure.
And so if we need to know the appraisal price because under the SLA, we wouldn't be forced to sell it for less than the appraisal price to another public entity. But those public entities can't know the number. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, when you're going into negotiations with an interested party, whether it's a public agency or another, or one of the housing sponsors on the list kept by HCD, I mean, the board and its negotiation person or team knows what the appraisal is, and uses that information as needed as part of the negotiation. I mean, it depends on the negotiation whether and how you disclose it and when. And so, I mean, I guess back to Riley's point, you don't want to. There wouldn't be much of a negotiation if everybody knew up front what that was. And so it's going to be an interesting, potentially complex process if there are multiple interested parties and we have different 90-day periods and we're negotiating with them. But yes, the Brown Act is clear, and and good reminder, Doug, that we did go into closed session a number of times when purchasing the Comcast building, because just like with any transaction, you don't want to be hindered from the start by not being able to leverage or to negotiate effectively.
Tom, go ahead.
Say if we have two parties interested in the property, can the negotiations be concurrent? Like we have a 90 days we have to negotiate, Can we negotiate with multiple parties during that same period, or?
You can try to, but they have 60 days to respond. So if one of them responds 2 days after receiving the notice and the other doesn't respond until 58 days after receiving the notice, it might be hard to do them concurrently. The 90 days starts when you begin negotiations. So if you get notices, I mean, this is all way down the line, but if you get a number of notices in, you could try to manage it so that they're around the same time, but it may, as a practical matter, be difficult to do that depending on when they come in the door.
There is, you pointed out earlier in an earlier slide, Andrea, that there are methods to dismiss offers, right, to compare them. So there are mechanisms within the statute to limit the complexity.
Yeah, I want to second what Steve just outlined. There is a prioritization within the kind of letter of AB 1486. And I think Andrea's done a good job of highlighting, but it does have a prioritization mechanism. The appraisal is just one of a number of those areas that really, in essence, looks at a quote unquote floor price. But I would say that, again, is just one of a number of areas to prioritize the offers that potentially come in through the SLA, and then to have a process that's responding in good faith to them as they come in.
And people are going to come in and bid literally what they are afford, what they could afford with. They would have some reason to do some research into comparables or what they think are right.
Yeah, President Silla, I would say when folks out there who are registered as part of this process through the HCD and or public agencies, once the notice of availability or the NOA is released, they will in turn self-perform their due diligence to make a determination, is this site of interest to us? Would we like to build a project in conformance with zoning and or housing, et cetera? So that the NOA, really kicks off the process such that interested parties have a fair and reasonable opportunity to express their interests. And then, thereafter 90 days. So, very simply, I would kind of perhaps think about it as a 150-day kind of process. Where various housing sponsors have the opportunity to express their interest and then to self-perform their due diligence and to then inform the district of their findings and also their terms and conditions and pricing of the land and or release of the land, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions on this item? That was really informative. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
All right, now we'll move on to agenda item number 3, discussion and direction on submitting comment letter to City of Larkspur Planning Division regarding general plan update for 2000 Larkspur Landing Circle. Steve, can I hand that back to you?
Oh, yes. I just real briefly, it's been almost 3 years. It was May 2018 when then President Doug Kelly signed a letter of comment to the City of Larkspur in a more scoping phase of the general plan update at the City of Larkspur, asking the City of Larkspur to be to treat the 2000 Larkspur Landing Circle property in a more flexible manner relative to the existing entitlements we discussed at the last informational meeting. And so that's an attachment to the item, the letter that was sent. And I will just say that the proposed letter that was drafted at this time because comments on the proposed general plan update, the draft update that was released in December 2020, a month ago, the comments on that draft update are due on February 4th. And so it was good timing to draft this letter in as a comment letter as a logical outgrowth of the draft general plan, which incorporated the comments from our district's letter in May 2018. And so we believe it's appropriate to send another letter under the board president's signature, as we did in May 2018, as a follow-on, a logical outgrowth of this communication with City of Larkspur, and namely acknowledging that they responded to our request for more flexibility in the general plan and that is proposed. And we talked about at the last informational meeting how they originated this mixed land use category specifically for this property, and how that creates the flexibility that we requested back in May. So we've drafted a letter. The team gathered around this concept, and then also the issue that Riley mentioned at the last informational meeting, that this notice of preparation that we're responding to is for an EIR, an environmental impact report for the general plan update. And it's a strategic opportunity for the district to comment about how the EIR should analyze certain scenarios that will create more flexibility down the road. By the City of Larkspur doing the environmental analysis at this time of potential land use at the site, it will streamline and make more efficient future environmental reviews, which could save, the collective between the City of Larkspur and the Ross Valley Sanitary District. We could be talking about saving hundreds of thousands of dollars and a couple of years in terms of process for environmental review if we work together with the City of Larkspur cooperatively at this time. So we wanted to point out that opportunity for governmental efficiency as well. So that's my overview, and hopefully you've had a chance to review the draft letter, and we welcome any discussion and comments.
So the letter was sent out separately by Julia. And do folks have any questions or comments on it? Yes, Pam.
It was already sent out?
Yes, it was sent out in an email yesterday at 6:57.
To the board, not to Larkspur.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, yeah, that's of course with a different color.
Sorry, I was
That's okay. So I just want to say, Mary, it was a good letter. Thing about planning, you don't want to do all the stuff and then realize that for planning in the future, well, that's not what we really wanted, or we've made changes. We're not going to put our offices there. So it's a very timely letter. I think it was good, or it's great. And then the laws have changed too. We're now dealing with different housing laws, and climate change is actually going to affect some of this too. So it looks like a good idea, and working with our partner, the city, I agree on the EIR. There will be other agencies perhaps so that will be putting an input besides us and Larkspur. Thank you.
Just to be clear, even though I'm signing it, I did not draft the letter. So those kudos go to the staff. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Tom.
I think the letter is pretty good, and it addresses they have to figure out what to do, how to use the land, the administration land that we're not going to use anymore. So they need to figure out what to do with that. And I think it's a good letter.
That's a good point, Tom. I should have mentioned that the fact that we purchased the Anderson building gives the city some flexibility to look at alternative scenarios that are, within the sideboards of what's reasonable in their own mixed land use proposal. So we just suggested that they exercise that flexibility. So thanks for pointing that out.
Any other comments or questions on this item or this letter?
I very much appreciate that we're going to try and let Larkspur handle the EIR for this, thereby streamlining and reducing costs for us. So I thought that was a very good move. suggestion.
You know, we have a CEQA expert as our general manager. So I'm not worried that we would make any missteps on CEQA. All right.
So do we need to, do I need to make a motion to accept that letter and ask the
What
board
about
to
the
send it?
public? Are there public comments?
Good point. Yep.
Thank you. Do any members of the public have any comments on this item or this letter?
Yeah, I do. Bob Silvestri.
Uh-huh.
Steve, could you clarify something for me that you said? Maybe I heard it wrong. So just as preface to that, there is an EIR on the project that was done in 2007. The EIRs do not expire. So therefore, it's very likely, based on the suggested general plan, which has not changed the uses at all. It simply has removed the designating where they are, right? The map has been extinguished, but the uses remain identical. Your use is a commercial use, which is allowed under the mixed use ordinance that they're proposing. So nothing's really changed. It's highly likely that if a developer comes, or a housing group or whatever comes with a qualifying mixed use proposal, that the EIR will likely be amendable rather than a new AIR. That's the first thing I just wanted to put out there. That is usually what you'd be looking at in this situation. But the thing that confused me is that the city doesn't do EIRs. They never do. EIRs are triggered by a final specific proposal that is accepted. In other words, the EIRs can't be done. They're far too expensive to be done during kind of a figuring out phase. So a city won't engage a consultant to do an EIR or amend an EIR until there's actually and Riley, you can agree, disagree, or comment on this, but until there's actually a proposal on the table. And, you know, as a developer, I've been in that situation many times. Everyone puts off doing anything to the EIR because it is expensive until they know they have a shot at doing the project, and you know you have a shot at a potential lease, you know, lessee or buyer. So I was confused by your saying that this is going to reduce costs or can be done somehow before you go through the entire process, first with the housing groups, then with, if they don't, you don't have a deal with them, then with other developers, all of this until you finally negotiate and have a contract, an under contract by some developer to do what they want to do, and they submit to zoning and planning to the city. You can't do it before then unless I'm misunderstanding what you said.
Yeah, I'm sure Riley can augment, but I'll answer the question that, you know, EIRs do have a shelf life, and an environmental analysis, however thorough, in 2007 is not going to be up to speed on the latest regulations or expectations. So an EIR that old will most certainly need to be updated. EIRs are in a couple of different categories. I've actually experienced doing general plan EIRs earlier in my career. And so that's what City of Larkspur's notice of preparation that they issued that we're responding to on February 4th is that they're preparing a program EIR. That's different than a project EIR.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a project.
Yeah, well, see, turns out the program EIRs cover a lot of the same ground as project EIRs if there's enough specificity at the program level. And it turns out, it turns out that there's a lot of specificity at the program level at the City of Larkspur because of the entitlements that we discussed at the last informational meeting. So, you know, there's already a lot of specificity in the program that can be used. And what's the purpose of an EIR? The purpose of an EIR is to disclose potential environmental impacts based on certain parameters that are known and to recommend mitigation measures to minimize those impacts. So that's very possible with the specificity that we have now in the general plan. But Riley, do you have anything to add?
Sure, I'll add a few things. Thanks, Steve. And just as a reminder for everyone, good afternoon, evening now, members of the board. My name is Riley Hurd, and I was engaged as the outside land use counsel in regards to this property. And when I did the entitlements memorandum, I concluded with the fact that the city had responded, quite efficiently to your request for some flexibility with the proposal of the new MU1. And thanks for the comments, Bob, and I'll respond to those. So first of all, an EIR was not done for the entitled project at this property. It was a mitigated negative declaration, and it was done quite some time ago. So back in 2015, the city wrote to your district and said, hey, in 2015, if you do exactly this project, you could perhaps rely on the adopted mitigated neg deck. But here we are 6 years later, and I would argue there are likely some changed conditions. And also, we may not seek to build exactly that project. So that was an MND, that was then. If you want to do exactly that, yeah, maybe you could get a crack at doing an addendum to it, but it could be tough because they did write to you again and say, at this point, now that the amount of time has elapsed, we would need to do an addendum and or a new document to address any new requirements not previously analyzed. So for example, just between then and now, we have at least 2 new sectors on the initial study. We looked at traffic in regards to VMT instead of level of service. There's a new greenhouse gas emissions analysis that's required. So there's a lot of things that have come online. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is the city absolutely is doing an EIR for the general plan, but it's programmatic in nature, as Steve pointed out. But even a program EIR can make certain assumptions about project statistics and plug them into it and review them. So this letter, it first supports the MU1 because it was directly responsive to our request. But second, it says, city, would you please, when you do your EIR, plug in some assumptions about this property? Take the density that we had, add on a little bit more for the fact that we're not putting a public facilities building there, and that will probably become residential. Of course, include the 100-room hotel. And maybe, if you want, think about the fact that we have all new density bonus laws, et cetera, and put that data in your EIR. Does that mean that you won't have to do environmental review for your project? No, it doesn't mean that.
Excuse me, could I just, I
No,
understand everything you're saying,
please, and then it will be your turn. Thanks.
but I agree with everything you're saying.
You hold on there, Bob. Let me
Yeah.
finish, then it will be your turn. So what it means is your project will be subject to the appropriate level of environmental review, but you have the potential to tier off of the programmatic EIR with any project-specific environmental review. So let's just say they plug in, 150, 200 units there. It's been studied. So you are getting efficiency gains by having to look at the changed circumstances or things that are different about your project. So it's not that the environmental review is done for your project. It's that this kind of baseline review is established that you can then tier off of and gain great efficiencies from. So that's why we're asking them to plug it in. And there's a lot of examples countywide of other jurisdictions making growth assumptions at properties that they know are going to be developed or that they know have capacity, throwing some units on it in their program EIR, and at least setting a base level of review to encourage a project to come in and facilitate it and get it to move forward. So that's the request, and it does add efficiency, and it would be great. So that's it. What's up, Bob?
Well, first of all, I totally agree with everything you guys just said. It wasn't actually my question. So maybe I misstated it. I understand that there is a program level to EIRs. At the program level, the EIR will say there are no significant impacts because it doesn't have, program EIRs do not specify projects. However, the housing element does specify already the 126 units that is proposed there, and that mitigated negative deck covered that. Any project that comes along at the project level is, of course, subject to a CEQA process. That CEQA process can take many forms. As you're saying, it could be another mitigated negative deck, it could be amendment to the mitigated negative deck, or it could be a new EIR process. And that is based, as Steve said, as you both suggested, on have there been any significant changes in the environmental issues since it was looked at last time. For instance, sea level rise is something that's changed, our understanding of it. So one would probably have to, in a project DIR, at least address, will sea level rise affect this property? There are lots of understandings like that. And so, no, I get that, and absolutely, but I've talked extensively with the city. They have no intention of changing the number of units that have been previously approved, either up or down. That's of record, and they're not going near that in the program EIR, and that's prudent. That's what they shouldn't do. And also, just informationally, the hotel is no longer in your process, really, with the city, is no longer actually required. Whereas if the guy who did the first thing in 2007, if he wants to come build exactly what he's built, as you presented to us, Riley, last time accurately, he can do that. He can, if he can strike a deal with you. But you may want to strike a deal with one of these housing sponsors instead. So then they have a different path. So I was just curious what you were expecting to get. Absolutely, there'll be another CEQA process at whatever the project level is, and absolutely all the input at the program level you want to put in, but the program is not going, the program EIR is not going to specify or change units or counts or square footages or anything. It's not going to go near it. So that's from talking to the city as recently as 2 days ago, going over all these issues. So I just offer that, if it helps.
Yeah, the city's the lead agency, so they will make the determination about what they put in their EIR. And so I think we'll leave it up to them.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Any other discussion? Okay, Pam?
Don't forget, the land belongs to Ross Valley Sanitary District, Riley. And that if we don't want something, the land is ours. The land is for the public. You know, it's their money, their land. When lots of people say, oh, it's just Larkspur. Larkspur's going to do everything and control everything. I don't think that's necessarily true. We haven't even engaged really in the public yet. So I want to be a little, walk a little gentler when we make those kind of statements. If you understand where I'm coming from.
Well, I understand 100%. You might be confusing my statements with those of Bob, because I'm very aware of who owns it, and the comment about the lead agency only has to do with the environmental review. This is your property. There's no requirement to build a hotel. There's no requirement to not build a hotel. I mean, you could do nothing with it. You could propose something totally different with it. You could do whatever you want that meets your, fiduciary duty and things of that like. So I'm with you all the way.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that we're working together with our sister city, but it is our land. So thank you.
But we're a sanitary district. We're not a land use entity, so we don't make decisions about how, and this is my perspective anyway, and I think there's some basis in law for saying it. We're not just going to use the property for some, from my perspective, what we perceive to be the public good. That's up to Larkspur.
The land belongs to the Ross Valley Sanitary District. It's owned by the people. So whatever philosophy you have, you have that right to it. But I just want to make it really clear to who's ever out there in the public right now, there's like 5 or 6 here, that yes, Larkspur has a general plan. Yes, they create that, they change it, they facilitate it, but the land does not belong to the city of Larkspur. It belongs to the sanitary district, the whole Ross Valley. So that's just my point.
Here's a good way to think about it. The owner and the applicant, which sometimes are the same and sometimes are different, control what is asked for at the property, what is applied for. It's up to you. You can apply for anything you want, you know, within reason. And then the city's only job is to hold up the code and the general plan and hold up the application and be sure they can be approved. But you govern what you want to seek at the property, and the city governs whether that can or can't be approved based on findings and evidence. And they have the burden to make those findings and evidence if they ever wanted to say no, and the same burden for saying yes. So that's how I always try to think about it.
That's very helpful, Riley. I like that analogy. Thank you.
All right, any other discussion from board or public? All right, seeing none, hearing none, I think we're ready to adjourn. Thank you
Oh,
all.
wait a minute, Mary.
Wait, got a
So we
recommend.
make a motion?
No, it's, oh, I'm so, well, discussion and direction. I'm sorry, I thought we agreed that it's a great letter. Do we need a
Well, we
motion?
did, but not officially. So I would move that we approve and send the letter.
I second.
Okay.
I third.
Council is giving me a smirk like, why not? Okay, sorry, I thought it was just direction, which I thought was pretty clear.
Sorry,
Julia,
yeah,
will you,
but we did recommend you authorize the board president, you, to, in coordination with legal counsel, to issue the attached letter.
okay.
That's the motion, I guess.
It seems the will of the board that we
Hold the board.
vote. So that was Doug, and then second,
Me.
Tom, and then Michael made a joke. All right, Julia, please call the roll. I'm sorry for blowing through this the way I am.
Okay, Borstein,
Yes.
Gaffney,
Yes.
Kelly,
Yes.
Megs,
Yes.
Zilla,
Yes.
unanimous vote. Thank you.
Now. Okay, now I'd like to adjourn this meeting. Thank you all, and I'll see you on February 10th.
Thank you, President Silla. Thank you, board members.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.